So next up on your agenda, you can see we have ethics, open meeting law, bylaws, and abstentions. And with us today is our Deputy District Attorney, Steve Sweikert. Steve's been with the county for a long time. Steve also represents our department on issues when we request an opinion or request some guidance. And so he knows these areas very well, in my mind at least. And so with that, Mr. Steve Sweikert.
Good morning, everyone. And as it was said, my name is Steve Sweikert, and I'm a Deputy District Attorney. I've been with the county for 22 years, and I have several assignments, including town services. I also advise the Public Response Office, which enforces zoning matters. I also advise animal control and social services and IT. The subject of today's presentation is ethics, open meeting laws, and bylaws, and now I've also been asked to discuss abstentions. Abstentions is not going to be a separate topic, but I'll cover it in relation to ethics and open meeting laws. Ethics includes behavior that relates to voting issues, and it can affect how the public meetings are held, and includes such things as disclosures, votings, and quorums. The open meeting law concerns the manner in which the public meetings are held, and includes such things as agendas and notice and how the public can participate. Training is required for the TABs and the CACs for both of these, and that's one of the reasons we're here today. Bylaws are rules for conducting the meetings, and they are generally limited to parliamentary procedures and picking the meetings, the dates, and officers, and such things as that. A few points before I begin. While you're here, don't discuss anything over which you have advisory business, because that would likely violate the open meeting law, and then we'd both be into trouble. Before the recent amendments to Clark County Code 2.42, there was a resolution that required that these presentations be presented in a layperson-friendly language, and that has been superseded by the code amendments, but we'll still keep it layperson-friendly, so it won't be a complicated presentation today. Ethics. What are they generally? A dictionary definition says that they are moral principles. They're covered by the ethical standards in Clark County Code 2.42. They're also covered by the Ethics in Government, NRS 281A, as well as to a degree your bylaws for the TAB and CACs. There's no longer a Clark County ethics policy, as that's been superseded by the amendments to the Clark County Code. The good news is, for the vast majority of the cases, these say the same thing and can be summarized. But first, let's look at the policy objectives for the ethics laws. Those are treating those persons and entities that deal with the government with impartiality, fairness, and equality. Second, assuring that the decisions of public importance are not influenced by private considerations. Next, maintaining public confidence in government, which implicates the appearance of matters. And finally, preventing the use of public office for private gain. Ethics summarized. Avoid even the appearance of impropriety to keep the public trust. That's probably the most important thing, keeping the public trust in government. Don't seek gifts for don't seek gifts or improper influence, unwarranted privilege, or preference. Be careful about doing deals with the government or private deals that also involve the government. Don't accept money from private sources for your public duties. Don't use insider information for personal gain. Don't suppress reports. Don't use government property improperly. Don't influence staff for personal gain, and when in doubt, ask for help. NRS 281A.020 provides very good and clear direction. A public officer or employee must commit himself to avoid conflicts between his public interests, his private interests, and those of the general public to whom he serves. The increasing complexity of state and local government, more and more closely related to private life and enterprise, enlarges the potentiality for conflicts of interest. I would add that the increasing use of social media also adds to this complexity. Practically everyone has a smartphone these days, and social media is very prevalent. And it's easy to get caught up in dealing with social media and getting involved in tit for tats and getting involved in improper arguments and such on social media. Ethics is not just about avoiding conflicts, but about avoiding the appearance of conflicts. Even if there's not an actual conflict, the appearance of one can undermine the public trust in government. Advice, reporting, and sanctions. If there's an issue, first contact your liaison first. If the liaison can't address the issue, then they can contact the DA's office, and we'll look into the issue more carefully. The Law or Ethics Commission's opinions may have the answer to any ethical dilemmas, but the Ethics Commission does not have oversight over the town advisory boards or citizen advisory councils. These advisory bodies are expressly excluded from Ethics Commission's oversight. Concerning sanctions, Clark County Code 2.42 may impose misdemeanor citation violations. And so that could be a fine of up to $1,000 and up to 6 months in jail. For county employees, that may include also terminations. But for town advisory board members and citizens advisory council members, that they serve at the pleasure of the Board of County Commissioners, so a violation could include removal from office. But now that we have elected members, these can't be removed by the Board of County Commissioners, so that makes it more likely that a violation would result in a criminal penalty being imposed. Next to the topic to cover is disclosure of actual and potential conflicts of interest. Disclosure can solve a lot of problems. Most importantly, it can remove the appearance of impropriety. Disclosure is only required if there is an actual conflict of interests. You must disclose gifts, loans, and other financial and personal interests. Disclosure must be sufficient to inform the public of the potential effect of the conflict of interests. Disclosure must be made at the time of consideration of the relevant item presenting the conflict. Disclosure must be made with sufficient information, assuming that no one knows anything about you. As I said before, disclosure may remove the appearance of impropriety. Abstention due to conflicts of interests. Disclosure by itself does not require abstention, but abstention for a conflict does require disclosure. Abstention is required if a hypothetical reasonable person would have his independence of judgment materially affected. Disclosure helps frame the hypothetical. Abstention is not required for a general benefit. The example I've used in the past is that disclosure is not required for a vote to lower everyone's taxes, but that wouldn't apply in your case. Perhaps a better example for the TABs and CAC is of a general benefit would be a vote to zone a good restaurant in your neighborhood. You don't have to abstain for that. Abstention should not be made lightly because it is avoidance of your voting and deliberating responsibilities. You must disclose why or why not you will not abstain. After consultation with an attorney is usually sufficient. If you abstain, do not participate in the discussions. Even making statements of facts can be considered improper advocacy. This includes the comment periods. It's sometimes asked if you can abstain and then go and speak during the comment period, but that's something you can't do. You can't take off your hat and sitting on the board and then go sit in the public and speak in the public comment period. Abstention, if required, will reduce the number of members of the body, and by that potentially the required quorum. A commitment to others that require disclosure can include those who are members of your household or those who are related by blood, adoption, or marriage, employers of your members of your household, and those who with a substantial and continuing business relationship and similar important relationships. The next topic to be covered is the Nevada open meeting law. The most important section, in my opinion, is the first. It covers the legislative intent. It says at NRS 241.010, in enacting this chapter, the legislature finds and declares that all public bodies exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business. It is the intent of the law that their actions be taken openly and that their deliberations be conducted openly. So the idea is that there be no smoke-filled backroom deals. All the other sections of NRS Chapter 241 are designed to implement that legislative policy. The topics covered by the law include such things that are like, what are public bodies that are covered by the Act? Town advisory boards and citizens advisory councils are expressly included, so you are public bodies covered by the Act. What are meetings covered by the Act? That can be pretty complicated. There's a definition of a meeting, and it covers about a half a page. What special rules apply with regard to notices to the public? These include things such as agendas and posting locations, and in some cases, individual notice to persons. What type of emergencies justify suspending notice? As advisory bodies, I don't think you'll ever come across situations where you have emergencies, but that's something that's covered by the Act. When can meetings be closed off by the public? Again, as advisory bodies, I don't think you'll come into a situation where you'll have to close off meetings to the public, but if you do, it'll likely be a situation where you consider the character, misconduct, or competence or health of an individual. What kind of records must be kept, such as minutes, and how the law is enforced. How is the open meeting law enforced? To begin with, actions taken in violation of the open meeting law are considered void, but they can be corrected. Anyone harmed by a violation of the open meeting law can bring a lawsuit, or they can complain to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office is specifically tasked with enforcement of the open meeting law, and that office can bring civil or criminal actions to enforce against violations. The Attorney General's office can also issue both formal and informal opinions as to the open meeting law to help everyone comply with the law. The Attorney General's office has looked into town advisory boards in the past several times. Just the year before last, Enterprise Town Advisory Boards was investigated for a potential violation of the open meeting law. In that case, the complaint was rather unclear and lengthy, but it turns out what the complainant was really concerned about was he wanted something placed on the agenda and was unhappy that that wasn't the case. But the open meeting law doesn't require that the public be allowed to place matters on the agenda, so no violation was found. There's also such a thing as the Nevada Open Meeting Law Manual that is published by the Attorney General's office, and that's a very good resource to have. It covers extensively the law, including the NRS, opinions by the Nevada Supreme Court, and the Attorney General's office, and analysis on how to follow a law. If you don't have a copy of it, it's easy to obtain. Just Google Nevada Open Meeting Law Manual, and it's easy to find. It pops right up. It's updated fairly regularly. Although the latest edition is the 2016 one, it was updated last March. So it's fairly current, although it doesn't include the latest legislative changes. I recommend you obtain a copy if you don't have one. What are meetings covered by the Act? As I said before, it's a complicated situation, and there's a fairly long definitions. But those meetings concern things over which you have advisory powers. Lectures such as this and social functions are generally excluded, but if you gather and start talking business, then you'll have a problem, and that would be considered a meeting. So I was asked to talk about that a little bit more. So someone asked, what kind of events can you attend without it being a meeting? An example that came up in the past is like the developers' meetings. My general recommendation is that you don't attend such meetings in a quorum, particularly because there's the opportunity to ask questions, and that could lead to deliberations. But it's not necessarily a violation if you attend in a quorum. So if you do attend in a quorum, don't discuss matters. That would end up being deliberations. Generally try to avoid attending meetings where you may end up deliberating as a body, because that would be a violation of the open meeting law. As I said before, for there to be a meeting, there must be a quorum. And what is a quorum? A quorum is a simple majority of the membership and the necessary number of board members to act on a matter. As I was asked to spend some time discussing absences, vacancies, and abstentions in relation to the quorum requirement. Vacancies, their impact is not expressly addressed in the law. But as a quorum is a simple majority of the membership, we can say that a vacant seat does not count towards the membership. So if you have a board that's supposed to be composed of 5 members, but you only have 3 with 2 vacancies, the quorum would be 2 instead of 3, as it would be for 5 members. Absences, unlike vacancies, absences do not affect the quorum requirement. Rather, they are the measure of the quorum. They determine whether or not you have a simple majority. Abstentions act like vacancies or absences, depending upon whether or not the abstention is required. Sometimes people abstain without being required to, because of a conflict of interest. If required because of a conflict of interest, they reduce the membership of the board, acting like a vacancy. If not required, they do not reduce the membership and act like an absence, making it more likely that there will not be a quorum. Who makes the determination whether or not an abstention is required? The reason of the person making the disclosure because of the conflict of interest and abstaining should be presumed to be valid. However, if the reasoning is plainly erroneous, the chair can make a ruling on whether or not there is a quorum. There's also such a thing that's called a walking quorum, which is a series of meetings individually without, but collectively with a quorum. So if you go around talking separately to board members, you can create a walking quorum. Such meetings can be in person, but they could also be virtual. So they can be done by email, by video conference, by telephone, by chat rooms. So it would also take place over social media. You have to watch out that you do not collectively deliberate in such forums. Social media, as I mentioned before, it could be a useful tool or it could be a problem. It's good for making announcements, but for debate, you can end up being a troll or even a criminal for violating the open meeting law. One of the major dangers of social media is reducing your credibility. If you're insulting or you say bad things, people will eventually disregard what you have to say, and they will no longer listen to the advice you provide. As I said before, you can even by accident violate the open meeting law by creating a walking quorum. For social meeting law, discretion is strongly advised. When you talk about matters over which you have advisory powers, the best advice is save it for the sit-down meeting when you have the public notice provided so that everyone can hear what you have to say. Agendas. Agenda is probably the most important part of the open meeting law. It's not primarily to help the board members know what's going to be discussed at the meeting. It is to primarily help the public know so that they can know whether or not to attend the meeting and participate in the meeting. Yeah. And it's for that reason that you have to stick to the agenda. Emergency exceptions only apply to things that are unforeseen and require immediate action. You have to stick to the agenda. You cannot act or deliberate on matters that are not on the agenda. Matters that are brought up at public comment should not be acted or deliberated upon, except to the extent that they are later put on an agenda that takes place down the road. Because it was mentioned before by Alex, because of inconsistent practices in the past and legislative direction, the BCC has directed that town advisory boards and citizens advisory council follow a uniform agenda format. So staff now strictly control the agenda, and it's in a uniform format. Agenda items must be clear and complete. Generalities and vaguenesses must be avoided. A good agenda item will generally be pretty clear and packed with detail so that members of the public can make decisions based upon those details. However, unfortunately, sometimes general terms in the agenda cannot be avoided, but these should be as limited as possible and as few as possible. And then when necessarily, only used for discussion items. Items must indicate whether they are for action or discussion. Agendas must spell out any rules you have within limits and within reason for public comments. They must indicate the time, place, and location of the meetings and the locations of the postings of the notices. Agendas must have a public comment period at the beginning of the meetings or before every item, as well as a public comment period at the end of the meetings. Agendas must have a statement about assistance to the physically handicapped. Public notices must be posted at least 3 days in advance in 4 prominent public places, the places of the meeting as well as 3 other places, and must be provided individually upon request to persons and be posted on the internet. Agenda and backup material must be provided to the public at least and before to the public at and before the meetings. In the 2019 legislature, there were a few updates to the open meeting law. They weren't very extensive, but there were a few of them. The legislature provided clarifying language that video conferencing of meetings is permissible and placed responsibility on the chair of the public body to make sure that the members of the body can participate and that the public can hear or observe the members of the body. They provided that training of the open meeting law by a lawyer is accepted from the definition of the meeting. So if there's any question that this presentation was a public meeting, and that's been resolved that it's not. But they nevertheless provided the caveat that it could be a meeting if you deliberate at such a meeting. So the caveat still applies. Don't discuss any advisory business at this meeting today. They provided a new rule for subcommittees in the definition of a public body, and this is where it gets kind of complex. So I'll just briefly read the definition of the public body, and says a subcommittee or a working group consists of at least two persons who are appointed by the public body if a majority of the membership of the subcommittee or working group are members or staff members of the public body that appointed the subcommittee, or the subcommittee or working group is authorized by the public body to make a recommendation to the public body for the public body to take action. And we're all familiar with backup material to agenda items that support the agenda items. The NRS calls this backup material supporting material, and until this last legislative session, there was no definition of it. We now have a definition, but it doesn't provide any surprises. It just means material that at least that is provided to at least a quorum of the members of the public body by the members of the staff of the public body, and that the members of the public body would reasonably rely on to deliberate or to take action on a matter that is in the published agenda. The term includes, without limitation, written records or audio recordings, video recordings, photographs, and digital data. The most heavily edited, updated section of the open meeting law is that dealing with the Attorney General enforcement sections. Without getting into too much detail, there is now a system of a two-tiered statute of limitations with 120-day and 1-year limitation periods, depending upon whether or not there is a violation that was discoverable. And also fines for violations of the open meeting law have gone up from $500 to a graduated increase from $500 to $2,500. But they provided a safe haven from liability if you act upon the advice of an attorney employed or retained by the public body. The last section to discuss is bylaws. The question was presented earlier whether or not the town boards get to edit their bylaws. By law, they do. The NRS says each town advisory board shall establish bylaws for town meetings and other materials for internal governance. This is limited to internal governance, and the bylaws cover matters other than internal governance. This must be balanced by NRS 269.525.5, which says, finally, the purpose of the unincorporated town government law are to provide for the formation of unincorporated towns and their government according to a uniform plan within the framework of county administration for unincorporated areas. So there needs to be a balance struck between the ability of the town advisory boards to manage their bylaws and the county's ability to establish a uniform plan to administer the town advisory boards. So that's why the changes to the bylaws would require careful consideration before amendments take place. But there are some matters that would require could require amendments, such as meeting locations or meeting dates. The core of bylaw authority for internal matters is parliamentary procedure. Functionally, you follow a simplified form of Robert's Rules of Orders that are relaxed. As it was discussed, it's the BCC Rules of Procedure Handbook, which is a simplified form of Robert's Rules of Order. One exception to that, as provided in the bylaws, is that second to a motion is not required. Many rules of the NRS and the Clark County Code are simply repeated in the bylaws. They don't have to be in the bylaws, but they can't be disregarded. It's helpful to have them in the bylaws. For example, the bylaws repeat that there's an ethical obligation to avoid conflicts of interest. There's also a reference to Clark County Code 3.01, which requires the removal of members for 3 unexcused absences. The bylaws cover appointment of officers and the methods of resignations. Special meetings can be called by the chair. The issue came up as to whether or not a liaison can call off a special meeting set by the chair. Unfortunately, that issue is not addressed by the law or the bylaws, and sometimes in emergencies, the liaisons must take actions, and my advice is that the chair and the liaison work together to resolve such issues. Finally, who can put matters on the agenda? The Board of County Commissioners, Administrative Services, Comprehensive Plannings, and members of the Town Advisory Boards and the Citizen Advisory Councils can place matters on the agenda. The public is not entitled to have matters placed on the agenda, but upon their request, it can be done with the consent of the chair and administrative services. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Yes. It was asked whether town board members can have matters placed on the agenda, and the answer is yes. Yes, sir.
Do they have to be edited by administrative services when they do that?
Well, strictly speaking, I don't think they have to be, but I think they should be. Yes, sir.
Can town board members, CAC members meet with applicants prior to our meetings individually? We have on occasion requests from an applicant to meet and go over an application just as a preview, opening up the board of questions that we have prior.
I don't see a reason why not, unless it could create a potential conflict of interest, depending upon the facts of the situation.
I think Mark was asking when applicants sometimes ask to brief board members in advance. Some board members accept those, and in general, that's acceptable as long as there's not a quorum of the board meeting with somebody, but you're not obligated to meet with people in advance and be briefed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that. I do want to make a couple comments. One is that Regarding agenda items on our respective town board and CAC agendas, we do get requests, obviously, from town board members for agenda items, but we need to make sure that they comply with the law, that we need to make sure that they comply with the requirement of your role, which is that you're recommending to our Board of County Commissioners exclusively for certain action that you're taking. So even though we do get those requests, it is incumbent upon our liaisons, and at that point, at some point, if I need to get involved and talk with our folks, talk it through, I will as well. And we always would or could consult our DA just to ensure that we are that the item is clear, it's concise, and it's trying to achieve the action that is being requested for the recommendation to our Board of County Commissioners. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that too. It's not just about putting an item out there, but it's also about making sure that it's clear and it's actionable. I'll